In the middle of a live congressional hearing, Karoline Leavitt muttered "Go back to Africa" under her breath. She didn't know her mic was on, but what Jasmine Crockett said in response, it left the entire room speechless and America watching. The air inside the Kansas state capitol was dry and charged with anticipation. Folded papers, clinking pens, murmurs under breath, signs of a panel that had run too long and gotten too personal. You could almost feel the tension sticking to people's jackets like dust. The Congressional Subcommittee hearing on education policy had dragged into its third hour and tempers were flaring. Representative Jasmine Crockett, sitting tall in a blue blazer, had been quiet for most of the last segment, not because she didn't have anything to say, far from it, but she was picking her moment. She always did. Across from her sat Karoline Leavitt, once a television face on morning politics, now a senior aide on federal education reform, sharp-tongued, ambitious, and never one to back down. Today, though, she looked agitated, defensive. Something about being challenged, especially by a black woman with presence, rubbed her the wrong way. When Jasmine finally spoke, her tone was firm but level. "So what you're suggesting," she said, glancing directly at Karoline, "is that schools in underserved districts simply aren't trying hard enough?" Karoline crossed her arms, shifted in her seat. "I'm saying standards have to be enforced across the board, no exceptions, but the board was never level." Jasmine shot back, keeping her voice steady. "We can't talk fairness without addressing access. Context matters, so does history." Karoline scoffed quietly. The microphone in front of her was still on. "That's when it happened." She leaned slightly to her left, not directly into the mic, but close enough. Her voice, muttered but crisp, bled into the speakers just enough to make the words unmistakable. "She should just go back to Africa." A beat of silence, then a cough, a shuffled paper, a tightening throat somewhere near the back of the room. The sound didn't seem to register right away until a black intern near the media table stiffened. His head turned slowly toward the speaker. C-SPAN's feed didn't miss a beat. It was live. A few people looked toward Jasmine as if expecting her to storm out, say something loud, but she didn't. Instead, she kept her hands folded. She blinked slowly and she waited. The chair of the subcommittee, an older man from Idaho, cleared his throat. "Let's stay on topic, please." Karoline didn't flinch. She reached for her water bottle and took a sip like nothing had happened, but her ears were red. That's when she knew the mic had caught her. Outside, the clip was already being clipped and captioned. Inside, Jasmine looked directly at her, not angry, not broken, just steady. It was the kind of look that said, "You think you hurt me, but all you've done is show the world who you are." Still, she didn't speak. She turned back to her notepad, made a single note, and let the session carry on like normal. That moment, those 10 seconds, said more than a monologue ever could. But silence doesn't stay silent for long, not when a microphone is live and the country is listening. The clip hit the internet before the panel session had even ended. Someone in the press box had recorded it on their phone, zoomed in on Karoline's face the second the words left her mouth. Within 20 minutes, the phrase "go back to Africa" was trending nationwide. Hashtags piled up, memes were already in circulation. The original video had been reposted, captioned, slowed down, analyzed, and debated in every possible way. Karoline's team knew it was bad the second they left the chamber. Her aide, a younger guy in a charcoal suit named Brian, walked quickly beside her. "We've got to say it was misheard," he whispered, shielding her from the cameras gathering at the end of the hall. "I mumbled," Karoline replied, not breaking stride. "No one knows what I said for sure, but she was wrong. People knew it was too clear, too sharp, too raw. You could hear it in the way she said back." The pause, the irritation, the dismissiveness behind it. They ducked into a staff hallway. Karoline pulled out her phone, already buzzing with texts from allies and party members. Some were furious, some were warning her, but none were defending what she said. A statement had to be crafted immediately. By the time the press team issued their first response, Miss Leavitt was misquoted due to background noise and misinterpretation. "She stands firmly against all forms of racism and bias." The public had already decided people weren't just angry, they were disappointed, not just because of what was said, but because of how often things like this happened, followed by excuses, deflection, and PR spin. The pattern was tired. People had seen it too many times. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett said nothing. Reporters followed her to the elevator. One asked, "Congresswoman, do you want to respond to Miss Leavitt's comment?" She glanced at them, then pressed the elevator button. Her reply was simple, "Not yet." That yet did something strange. It lit up both sides. Her supporters called it graceful restraint. Her critics called it calculated theater. Inside a quiet cafe near the Capitol, 3 staffers for another representative huddled around a laptop watching the clip again. One of them, a middle-aged white man with tired eyes, rubbed his temples. "This is gonna go nuclear," he muttered. "If she speaks, it'll be everywhere." "She's going to speak," the younger staffer said. "She has to." But Jasmine wasn't in a rush. She spent that evening at her hotel, far from cameras, sitting with her mother, who had flown in from Texas Texarkana the day before they had dinner in silence for a while. Then her mother said, "You're going to say something, baby?" Jasmine looked out the window. The city lights were flickering under a cloudy sky. "Yeah," she said, "but it won't be what they're expecting." Elsewhere, Karoline wasn't sleeping. She sat on her hotel bed, laptop open, watching cable news. Looped the clip again and again. Her phone buzzed with missed calls from party donors and former colleagues. People were jumping ship already, some saying she needed to go quiet for a while, others suggesting she offer a formal apology. But Karoline wasn't wired for humility. "Not yet." "She misheard me," she said again, mostly to herself. Brian, still seated across the room, didn't respond. He just stared at her, not with judgment, just with worry. It wasn't just about her career anymore. This moment was bigger than both women, and Karoline was beginning to realize she didn't control the narrative anymore. But power shifts when people least expect it, and Jasmine was about to take control in a way no one saw coming. The next morning, the Capitol cafeteria was oddly quiet. Cameras lined the hallway outside the press room, cords snaking across the tile floor. Reporters sipped burnt coffee and kept one eye on their phones. Something was coming. They could feel it. At exactly 10 a.m., Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stepped up to the podium alone. No entourage, no stacked flags behind her, no speech writers in the wings, just her, a black folder in hand, and that same calm she carried in the chamber the day before. The cameras clicked as soon as she took the mic. She waited a second, not too long, just enough for people to focus. Then she opened the folder, looked at it once and closed it again. "I was going to read something prepared," she said, "but I don't think I need to." She leaned slightly into the microphone. "What happened yesterday wasn't new to me." Her voice didn't shake. It didn't try to sound righteous or poetic. It just was present, measured. "I've been told to go back since I was a teenager." Standing in a line at a store in Shreveport back then, it was an older woman who didn't like how I looked her in the eye. "I've heard it on airplanes, I've heard it whispered in elevators, I've even heard it in boardrooms, though more politely phrased. So no, I wasn't shocked." She paused. A few reporters shifted in their chairs. "What shocked me," she continued, "was that some people thought I should be shocked, like it was the first time something like this had ever slipped out, like this was some tragic accident in a world that usually runs on respect. That's not the country I've known." The room stayed quiet. No clicks now. No one dared interrupt. "I want people to understand something," she said. "When you tell someone to go back, you're not questioning their citizenship, you're questioning their belonging, their value, their place at the table." She looked directly into the camera. "And I'm not going anywhere there." It was the line that punched through 1,000 screens before the press conference was even over. It hit in classrooms, in barbershops, on back porches, in towns that hadn't heard of Jasmine Crockett before but knew that tone, that resolve. She didn't cry, she didn't yell. She told a story. "One year my father took me to Washington, D.C. We stood outside the Supreme Court, and I remember him saying, 'This building belongs to you too.' I was 11. I didn't believe him. I still have days when I don't." She exhaled. "But I came here anyway. I ran for office anyway. I take up space here anyway, not because I was invited, but because I knew I didn't need permission." Her words weren't polished in that speechwriter way. They were too sharp, too personal. "I'm not here to shame Karoline Leavitt," she said. "I'm here to remind people watching that belonging doesn't have to be earned with perfection. We belong because we're human, because we wake up here, fight here, build here, love here. We belong because our ancestors did the work that made this place even possible." She took a breath, letting the silence land before her next sentence. "And if that makes someone uncomfortable enough to say what she said, then maybe that discomfort is something they need to sit with, not me." The press conference ended with no questions taken. She folded her folder, stepped away from the podium, and walked out like she had something better to do than argue. And she did. Her phone started ringing seconds later. People crying, people cheering, even people from the opposite side of the aisle texting. "You said what I couldn't say out loud." But not everyone clapped, and some were preparing a backlash that would test everything Jasmine just stood for. By noon, Jasmine's words had been clipped and posted to every platform that mattered. Millions watched the clip before lunch. Some played it back more than once, not because they missed it, but because they needed to feel it again. Across the country, people responded in ways you don't often see anymore, not in slogans, not in hashtags, in stories, in voices. In a small diner outside of Toledo, Ohio, an older black man named Reggie sat in a booth he'd claimed as his own for 20 years. He leaned over his coffee cup and said to the waitress, "I didn't even know her name before this, but now that woman's got steel in her spine." In Flagstaff, Arizona, a Navajo high school teacher paused her lesson, pulled up the video on the classroom projector, and let her students sit in silence. Then she said, "That's how you carry yourself when they try to cut you down." And in Fresno, California, a retired white veteran named Bill took to Facebook for the first time in over a year just to post one sentence. She spoke for more than just herself, but not everyone saw it that way. Conservative radio wasted no time spinning the narrative. One host in Des Moines barked into the mic, "This is another orchestrated attempt to play the victim, to divide us. She's Grandstanding callers phoned in, some agreed, some pushed back. She didn't throw a fit. One caller said she told the truth. You don't like how it sounds? Maybe you should ask yourself why Karoline stayed silent. Her team released another statement, longer this time and polished. It offered regret if her words were misunderstood, but stopped short of admitting anything. The internet dragged it apart that night. Karoline paced inside a borrowed townhouse in Arlington, Virginia, windows closed, lights off. She watched the clip again. Jasmine's words, the poise, the quiet fire underneath. She muttered under her breath, "She's winning this." Her aide Brian nodded from across the kitchen. "You're not going to spin out of this, not this one." "I didn't mean it like that," Karoline whispered. "It just slipped." Brian leaned on the counter. "That's the problem." Elsewhere, the impact kept growing. On a college campus in Madison, Wisconsin, students filled an auditorium meant for an unrelated panel. The event morphed into a discussion on identity, belonging, and who gets to feel at home in America. Jasmine's speech played on a loop between speakers in a barbershop in Mobile, Alabama. Older men paused mid-cut to talk about the way she handled herself. One man said, "Back in my day you get loud or swing." She did neither. That takes more strength than people know. But the weight of the moment was hitting Jasmine too. She sat alone in her apartment, lights low, a glass of water in hand. She hadn't turned on the news. She didn't want to hear her name said by people who've never known what it felt like to carry the kind of silence she did on that panel floor. Her phone buzzed again, a message from a name she hadn't expected to see: Senator Leah Drummond, a conservative from Texas. The message was short, that was powerful. "Would you meet?" Jasmine stared at the screen, not because she was shocked, but because in that moment the world felt heavier than ever. Her words had shaken something loose. People were listening, and now people who had never sat across from her wanted to talk, but one person still hadn't said anything, and when she did, it would change the whole tone of the conversation. In the middle of a live congressional hearing, Karoline Leavitt muttered, "Go back to Africa," under her breath. She didn't know her mic was on, but what Jasmine Crockett said in response, it left the entire room speechless. In America watching, the air inside the Kansas state capitol was dry and charged with anticipation. Folded papers, clinking pens, murmurs under breath, signs of a panel that had run too long and gotten too personal. You could almost feel the tension sticking to people's jackets like dust. The congressional subcommittee hearing on education policy had dragged into its third hour and tempers were flaring. Representative Jasmine Crockett, sitting tall in a blue blazer, had been quiet for most of the last segment, not because she didn't have anything to say, far from it, but she was picking her moment. She always did. Across from her sat Karoline Leavitt, once a television face on morning politics, now a senior aide on federal education reform, sharp-tongued, ambitious, and never one to back down. Today, though, she looked agitated, defensive. Something about being challenged, especially by a black woman with presence, rubbed her the wrong way. When Jasmine finally spoke, her tone was firm but level. "So what you're suggesting," she said, glancing directly at Karoline, "is that schools in underserved districts simply aren't trying hard enough?" Karoline crossed her arms, shifted in her seat. "I'm saying standards have to be enforced across the board, no exceptions." But the board was never level. Jasmine shot back, keeping her voice steady. "We can't talk fairness without addressing access. Context matters. So does history." Karoline scoffed quietly. The microphone in front of her was still on. "That's when it happened." She leaned slightly to her left, not directly into the mic, but close enough. Her voice, muttered but crisp, bled into the speakers just enough to make the words unmistakable. "She should just go back to Africa." A beat of silence, then a cough, a shuffled paper, a tightening throat somewhere near the back of the room. The sound didn't seem to register right away until a black intern near the media table stiffened. His head turned slowly toward the speaker. C-SPAN's feed didn't miss a beat. It was live. A few people looked toward Jasmine as if expecting her to storm out, say something loud, but she didn't. Instead, she kept her hands folded. She blinked slowly and she waited. The chair of the subcommittee, an older man from Idaho, cleared his throat. "Let's stay on topic, please." Karoline didn't flinch. She reached for her water bottle and took a sip like nothing had happened, but her ears were red. That's when she knew the mic had caught her outside. The clip was already being clipped and captioned inside. Jasmine looked directly at her, not angry, not broken, just steady. It was the kind of look that said, "You think you hurt me, but all you've done is show the world who you are." Still, she didn't speak. She turned back to her notepad, made a single note, and let the session carry on like normal. That moment, those 10 seconds, said more than a monologue ever could. But silence doesn't stay silent for long, not when a microphone is live and the country is listening. A week passed, but the conversation never really cooled down. It reached people who rarely paid attention to politics, like truck drivers catching the replay on their radios outside Wichita, or teens dissecting the story in group chats between school bells in Eugene, Oregon. The moment had cracked something open, not just just about race, about civility, about how quick we are to write people off and how rare it is to witness someone stand firm without firing back. On local television, round tables popped up, experts analyzing Jasmine's speech, Karoline's apology, and everything in between. Some called it a master class in grace under pressure. Others said Jasmine let Karoline off too easy. One commentator on a late-night panel said there was no yelling, no theatrics, but somehow that made it hit harder. She didn't respond with anger, she responded with truth. Still, not everyone bought the apology. In Birmingham, a civil rights activist named Lori Price went live on social media. "This isn't just about words," she said, "it's about the weight behind them. An apology means nothing if the culture that created those words doesn't shift." Meanwhile, inside her quiet office, Jasmine sat reading handwritten letters, hundreds of them. One caught her eye. It came from a fifth-grade girl in Boise, Idaho. She had drawn a picture of Jasmine standing at a podium with the words, "You talk like my mom," calm but strong. That one stayed on Jasmine's desk, but she also knew the praise could fade just as quickly as it came. She spoke to a small group of interns later that week. "No cameras, no notes, don't aim to go viral," she told them. "Aim to go forward. This town will chew up the loudest person in the room. You win by being consistent, honest, human." Karoline, on the other hand, was still walking uphill, though her statement had softened some critics. Others weren't buying the shift. Protesters showed up at one of her events in Sioux Falls holding signs that read, "Words have weight." Inside her hotel room that night, Karoline stood at the mirror wiping off her makeup. She looked exhausted. Brian, her aide, sat by the window scrolling headlines. "You going to keep doing press?" She shook her head. "No, I think I need to learn before I talk again." It wasn't a resignation, it was something else. Maybe the start of accountability, maybe just the sting of reality. Either way, she seemed changed, not transformed, but at least disrupted. The media eventually moved on, as it always does. A scandal in another state took the headlines and pundits shifted gears, but something lingered, not on front pages but in kitchens, in office break rooms, in casual conversations where someone would say, "Did you see that speech?" and the other person would nod and reply, "Yeah." She said it how it needed to be said. At the airport in Santa Fe, a woman in TSA uniform stopped Jasmine gently. "You reminded us what power can look like when it's quiet." Jasmine smiled. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't think it would echo this far." The woman nodded. "It did. Not every story ends in fireworks. Sometimes it's the stillness after the storm that sticks the longest, but even stillness carries power if people are willing to sit with it and ask themselves what they're really learning." 2 months later, things looked normal on the surface. Congress was back in full swing. The news cycle had turned and everyone seemed to be talking about midterms, border bills, or the latest scandal from someone half the country didn't even vote for. But beneath the noise, something had shifted. In Charleston, South Carolina, a civics teacher started her fall semester differently. Instead of jumping into the Constitution, she showed her class the footage of Jasmine's press conference. Then she asked a simple question: "What does it mean to belong?" A student in the back raised her hand and said, "It means you don't have to explain why you're here." That answer stayed with her. Back in D.C., Jasmine Crockett didn't suddenly become a household name. She wasn't handed magazine covers or book deals. What she did get was a growing list of young staffers asking to work for her, not because she shouted the loudest, but because she said something that lasted. She also noticed a change in the hallways. People she'd rarely spoken to now nodded in passing. One congressman from Billings, Montana stopped her and said, "You didn't just defend yourself, you defended a lot of people who never got the mic." Jasmine paused, then smiled. That was the point. As for Karoline Leavitt, she remained out of the spotlight on purpose. She stepped away from media appearances. No book tour, no podcast circuit, no tears on camera, just work, quiet, consistent work. She'd meet with advocacy groups behind closed doors, not performative, just listening. One of those meetings was in Columbus, Ohio, with a local youth group focused on civic dialogue. A college student asked her directly, "What changed for you?" Karoline didn't dodge it. "Getting caught didn't change me," she said. "Getting challenged did, and I'm still figuring out what that means." Nobody clapped. They didn't need to. That wasn't the point. Later that fall, a quiet vote passed on a bill aimed at improving equity in federal school funding. Jasmine co-sponsored it. Karoline supported it too. They didn't stand next to each other. No photo op, no dramatic reconciliation, but they voted the same way. That detail didn't make headlines. It wasn't flashy, but to the people who'd been watching closely, it mattered. What happened in that panel room wasn't just about a comment, it was about who we choose to be when we're tested. Jasmine didn't come out of the situation with more fame, she came out of it with more weight behind her voice, the kind that doesn't vanish when the cameras shut off. And Karoline didn't become a villain, she became a mirror, forcing people to ask themselves, how many times have I said something in the dark I wouldn't say in the light? The truth is, this wasn't a story about a scandal, it was a story about a choice to speak up without screaming, to teach without shaming, to respond without reducing someone else to a mistake. In a time when everyone's expected to take sides, Jasmine chose something different. She chose clarity over Noise, and that choice, it left an impression far deeper than outrage ever could. Some moments in politics fade fast. This one didn't, because people don't forget when someone shows strength without cruelty. They remember the pause, the breath, the way someone stands when the floor shakes beneath them and they refuse to move. And maybe that's the lesson. You don't need to shout to leave a mark. You just need to be honest when it counts the most. If this story left you thinking, share it. And if you want more stories that speak to who we are and who we're trying to be, hit that subscribe button. We're just getting started.